On the first day of a new month, many Nigerians will greet their families, friends, and colleagues with Happy New Month messages. So let me start there. Happy New Month to our viewers in Nigeria, across Africa, and around the world. But this Happy New Month message is different from others in the past few years and heralds a change for Africa's largest economy. The greeting comes with the recognition that Nigeria's general elections are now 24 days away. A breakdown of voters from across the country shows that Lagos State has the highest number of voters with 7,060,195. This is followed by Kano State with 5,921,370, and then Kaduna rounds up the top three with 4,335,208 registered voters. On the opposite end of the ladder, the three states in Nigeria with the lowest registered voters are Yobe with 1,485,146 registered voters. Bayelsa is there also with 1,056,862 registered voters. And finally, Ekiti State, which has less than 1 million registered voters. In fact, the number for Ekiti State is 987,647. While the number of registered voters is the highest it's been in several election cycles, there is one particular demographic of voters that could make or break the day. When we come back after the break, we take on one of the most talked about elements of this year's election, the youth demographic. Will they define and decide Nigeria's 2023 election? The conversation will pick up after this. Now, don't forget to join the conversation using the hashtag #ElectionCentral. The Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, says of the final number of registered Nigerian voters at 93,469,008, 37 million of that number, about 39.5% of them, are young Nigerians between 18 and 34. That demographic is followed closely by those between 35 and 49, who accounts for 25.75% of registered voters at 33.4 million. Will Nigeria's youth decide the 2023 elections? My guest is Samson Itodo, Executive Director of YIAGA Africa. Now, YIAGA is a non-profit committed to the promotion of democratic governance, human rights, and civic engagement. The group was at the forefront of Nigeria's Not Too Young to Run campaign, which reduced the age limit for some elective offices here in the country. Samson, welcome to Election Central. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So when we look at the breakdown of registered voters and see that not only did young Nigerians make up the largest number of newly registered voters, they're the largest voting demographic overall. So in terms of starting this conversation, paint us a picture of what that really tells us about how these elections could shape up.
Well, it's not surprising that the largest bulk of those on the voters register are young people. You know, Nigeria is a young population, over 60% of its population. That's young people. So you would expect that the high number of young people should be on the voters register. But be that as it may, it goes to say three things. That first, young people are interested in democracy, they're interested in participating, and they want to contribute, you know, to the governance of their society, and that's why they are participating and they are registering to vote. Secondly, it's also the fact that young people have not lost faith in Nigeria. And the fact that you see more young people showing up to register to vote, it simply tells you that they have not lost faith with Nigeria. They've not lost faith with democracy, but they seem to be angry with the type of democracy that Nigeria practices. And if you look at across the campaigns, across the kind of questions that are shaping electoral competition ahead of the election, you just see anger in the land. And the fact that citizens are so disenchanted, but this disenchantment with political leadership has not deterred them from participating. If you look at the voters register, 12 million people registered to vote. And kudos to INEC for the online registration platform that it provided. For the very first time, people could commence voter registration online. Secondly, there was also the online claims and objections, where people could lay claims to either mistakes made to their names, or they could object to the registration of unqualified persons. And after all the cleanup was done, about 40% of those who are registered are between 18 and 34. Now, the figure released by INEC should be questioned. I don't think it's accurate, because the age classification used by INEC, 18 to 34, it's wrong.
It's broad.
And so the actual age is 18 to 35. So if you analyze it by 18 to 35, you will see that that figure actually increases. And this is the first time that INEC is using this age classification. I don't know what was the rationale behind it, but in previous reports on voter registration, they used 18 and 35. And what this simply tells us, with this figure, is that this election will be determined by young people. It will be, its outcome, will be defined by how young people show up, to cast their votes. Yes, it's good to be 40% in the voters register, but that number would remain figures for analysis.
Yes.
If young people don't make those numbers count. And the only way to do that is to show up in the next couple of weeks to vote, because the level of youth turnout for the 2019 election was abysmally poor. 12 million young people voted both in the presidential and in the governorship elections in 2019. Of this particular figure, only about 28%. There was less than 30% of young people who voted in 2019 elections. I want to believe that they will do different this time by showing up to cast their vote, and 50 or 60% of young people, if they show up to vote, trust me, Nigeria will get the leadership that it deserves.
Okay, so you mentioned two things, and I sort of want to pick up on that. You mentioned, of course, the anger and the dissatisfaction or disaffection that many young people feel when it comes to the politics and governance in Nigeria. But in terms of the top issues, the top of mind issues for young voters, be them 18 to 35 or even 18 to 35 or to 34, what do you think are those maybe 2 or 3 top issues that are really going to galvanize them to come out?
I think the first thing is young people are just tired with just old and expired politicians who recycle themselves in public office. Young people are tired. They're tired of the old order. They want a new order. And I see them actually voting for leaders who are probably anti-establishment politicians. Because they believe that anti-establishment politicians are more likely to represent popular or public interest than the establishment politicians who are deeply entrenched and have used political power to advance inter-elite agenda and not necessarily public interest. The second one is jobs and the economy. And these two go hand in hand. If you look at unemployment rate, it's risen to about how many percent? About 33%. If you look at the level of underemployment, if you also look at life expectancy, when you look at all the development indicators, it is just clear that young people have been worse off than better off, despite their level of contribution to national development. And so jobs and economic opportunity is one of the biggest issues on the table, and it's on the ballot for young people when they go to cast their votes in the next couple of weeks. The third one is about insecurity. This is one issue that affects everyone, but young people are more on the receiving end. And when they go to vote, they just want a leader and leaders that can provide the welfare and security, which is the primary purpose of government. But what you currently have, where young people don't feel safe in their society, where young people are the targets of security institutions like the police, they are victims of police brutality. Look at the incident that happened in Lagos not too long ago. You see, all of this has created a lot of anger in the land because the state does not care, because justice is for those who can afford it and not justice for all.
Yes.
So these are some of the issues that young people actually care care about. And when they vote in the next couple of weeks, it's going to shape the way they vote. And you can clearly see from the kinds of conversations that young people are having, not just on social media, but also offline.
All right, so let's look at something else I found quite interesting. And it's not just young people doing this, it's actually Nigerians across the spectrum. There's a lot of attention at the center on the presidential election, but governance matters at all levels. And we've seen this when it comes to constitutional amendments. I can even reference what happened with Taraba State when you were trying to pass through the not too young to run amendment. You have to be concerned with the people who are also in the governorship level as well as the state houses of assembly. But do you think young Nigerians are equally invested or even invested at all in the governorship and state houses of assembly elections that will hold on March the 11th?
Quite frankly, I don't see that level of interest and that level of engagement, and that's something we need to change. And if you follow the data, you discover that successively for elections, and the turnout for governorship elections is always lower than presidential elections, except in some contexts, because we have outliers when you look at the data. But why are people not just interested, in state level elections? Because all the attention, is on the center. And I'll hold three institutions responsible. First is the media. I think often the media focuses attention on the presidential elections and what happens at the center. And the amplification and visibility given to state level elections is quite limited. Though there have been some improvement, but I think media needs to do more to be with satellite on what's happening at the local level. If you check debates, if you check things like town halls, they mainly covered just activities conducted by presidential candidates or political parties at the national level. And so there is need to focus on the state election because the state elections are the closest, to the people. And for citizens, and particularly young people, they need to keep at the back of their minds that the closest leaders that they can have within their reach are their members of the state houses of assembly. Every Nigerian is represented by one member in your state house of assembly, one member in the federal house of representatives, one in the Senate. And so you need to be interested in what happens at the state legislature as well as the National Assembly, yes, because the legislature holds the executive to account. They watch and provide that oversight and ensure that your interest, is protected. They are the ones who make the laws. So if there's a problem with our laws, it's the lawmakers who make the laws. So if you have individuals who are not accountable, who don't have capacity, who don't have character, all they will do is to go to the parliament and become rubber stamp of the executive. This is why every election is important, not just the presidential elections.
All right, so in 2022, there was an ASU strike that lasted several months. It affected the academic calendar for public tertiary institutions. Now, because of that, what we're seeing is that millions of students who should be taking part in the elections will likely be in school because of exams. Some estimates put the number at around 3.5 million students who would be affected if the academic timetable stands as it is. Now, INEC said students account for 40% of newly registered voters for this year's polls. If students didn't register in school, they could be unable to vote. Samson, this is a big issue, and I know a lot of people are talking about this, students themselves in particular. But what's really the best way to handle this? Because this looks like the disenfranchisement of millions of duly registered legal voters in Nigeria.
I think there are three things. One, schools that have fixed examinations during the election should reverse it because it will amount to disenfranchisement. Two, schools should not run academic activities during the period of the elections to enable students participate in the elections. Please note that it's not just voters. INEC is also going to recruit students, as ad hoc officials. So if they are going to be engaged in a very important activity of this nature, I think that the state and the government needs to do everything it can to get young people to cast their votes. The third one is about the PVCs of students who registered while they were at home during the ASU strike. Quite frankly, I think INEC can engage with the National Universities Commission to address this issue. It's either the PVC goes to these students while they're in school, but the big question is if it goes to the students while they're in school, when it's time to vote, are they going to be able to travel back, to their place of residence or where they register to cast their vote? These are some of the complexities that we need to engage. But my personal opinion is that it will amount to injustice, and also it will be unfair that students will be disenfranchised just on the basis of their academic goals. And this is really unacceptable. And honestly, I think it can be done. We just need to think outside the box, because that's quite a large number.
Yes.
3-something million can not only swing elections, but it will deliver victory to any candidate. We've seen the margin of lead between presidential candidates over the last 2 or 3 successive elections, and it's not been up to 3 million. And so this number is quite high. And I urge INEC and I urge the National Universities Commission, as well as other regulatory institutions for tertiary education, to sit down and think about the best way to approach this. Conducting exams during the period of elections, it's totally unacceptable.
So interestingly enough, for this election, it's not just the young demographic of registered voters that we are paying attention to, but we're also looking at some of those running for elective office. So this is now the second general election Nigeria has had after the Constitution was amended to reduce the age for elective offices, even though the age limit for senators and governors was not actually reduced. So in terms of even having more young candidates, whatever your definition of young may be, as long as they're legal, is that really something you've also seen happen with the 2023 elections? Younger people putting their hats in the ring, so to speak, to get into elective office here in Nigeria?
Absolutely. A lot of young people have indicated interest. But, YIAGA Africa publishes the youth candidacy report for every general election. And in this particular election, we did record a decline in the level of youth candidacy. In 2019, the level of youth candidacy was 34%. But in 2023, the figures went down to about 28.6%. And there are several reasons that account for this decline. The first one is the cost of politics. And in the last few months ago, we all witnesses to the fact that political parties introduced high cost of nomination forms, and that precluded young people from contesting for their parties ticket. The second is the lack of internal democracy in political parties. Candidates or young people expressed interest. Some of them won the primaries, but they were later substituted illegally by the leadership of the political party just to pacify certain vested and entrenched interests within their parties. And this is one of the biggest challenges that young people have to grapple with. Of course, the third reason was the fact that there was a reduction in the number of political parties due to INEC's deregistration. And so these are some of the issues that young people actually face, and this decline. But if you check amongst the political parties, because we also ranked political parties based on the number of candidates, that they nominated. And when we did the party ranking, it was clear that the African Democratic Congress, ADC, was the first because it presented the highest number of youth candidates. The APC and PDP were somewhere between 13th and 15th, and so really performing poorly when it comes to nomination of youth candidates. If you also check the data, which region has the highest concentration of youth candidates? And it's the Northwest. The Northwest has nominated, more youth candidates than any other region in the last 3 election cycles. In 2015, it was Northwest. In 2019, it was Northwest. And then in 2023, it's the Northwest that has the highest concentration of young candidates.
All right, Samson, because of time, I have to let you go, but I know that the conversations will heat up and continue to increase as we get closer and closer. It's 24 days now, and this is the election that people have said Nigeria's young people will define and will also decide. So we look forward to seeing how history will be made. Samson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Always a delight.
Thank you so much. And of course, the time is never with us, but it is what we have to do in terms of bringing you updates in terms of what's happening as we head towards the elections. Now, before we leave you, and you're going to see a voting process infographic video for you. That's just going to give you information on what to do. It's really less than 24 full days before the polls will open in Africa's largest economy. The Independent National Electoral Commission listened to the pleas of Nigerians and extended the deadline for the collection of the permanent voter card by 1 week. Registered voters now have till February the 5th to collect their PVCs in order to participate in the elections. Make no mistake, this election is critical. Nigeria is large enough to change the fortunes of the entire region through its own success or failure. And this general election is not just a Nigerian or African event, it really is a global one. I'll leave you with a voting process so you know what to do when you get into the polling units on election day. That's on behalf of Election Central. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Do have a fantastic night.